So who made them? The problem is still that most of the prints aren't signed. Were they all made by Mizuno? He seems not to have had a retail outlet of his own, shop of his own, though he would sell from his studio. In the early days there were adverts from Fukushima, and then after a gap of a few years mainly from Ogawa. But they're crediting the maker, so that we know that in both of those cases, although he is not the retailer, he is the manufacturer. We found one print with Ogawa's name on it. The evidence is thin, but it's probable that Ogawa was selling product made by Mizuno. Why? Well, in 1893, the Japan Mail newspaper said the process is unknown outside the studio where it is applied. This was within a description of Mizuno's studio. Ogawa and Mizuno knew each other well, and the period of Ogawa's activity is during the currency of Mizuno's patent. So his patent was still valid. Ogawa was much less active. We've only seen one print with his sticker actually on it, and it's in a frame that's identical to the frames that Mizuno was using. Ogawa himself makes no claim to any patent. The process is tricky to operate, requires a lot of experience to get good, consistent results. So, for all those reasons, I think it is highly likely, although they aren't signed, that the prints, that all of the prints on wood, lacquered wood, were by Mizuno. Now, Type D is a bit of a different story. The process is different, the material that they're printed on is different, they don't look the same. But we still have no evidence of it being anybody else. There is nobody else with a patent, there is nobody else publishing any claim in the press that they make these things. So we don't have any other candidates as the producer of these of the glass prints for Type D. So that was the state at the point that we wrote the article in 2007. A little bit about mail order and marketing. Here's the back of a jewellery cabinet. It's unusual for something like a cabinet to have his name on it. Normally they are not marked, but this one is. It's got the standard Mizuno stamps on it, here and here, in Japanese and English, but also a further one identifying Mizuno unmarks Yokohama, Penang, Amsterdam. So what this is marketing for mail order. As I said, you could send your negative to wherever, get it processed and sent back. The Photographic Times of New York said copies can be made from any picture sent in. The Scoville and Adams Co. are agents for these goods. Now, Scoville and Adams, we know them, don't we? One of my Mizuno types came with this flyer, and the original is over there. Now the US agent is Kondo and Company, not Scoville and Adams. The Great Invention of Unfadable Gold and Silver Lacquer Photographs by Mr. H. Mizuno. The details of the patent. Gold medals in World's Fairs at Chicago, St. Louis and New York. So obviously his agents are exhibiting for him in big places where lots of people will see them. The pictures are produced on the gold and silver lacquer ground, and the basic foundation is hinoki wood. I think hinoki is some sort of cedar. So then we come to this question of the origin of the glass prints type D. All was going quite well until this turned up. And you might say, well, okay, what's special about this? Well, what's special about this is the castle in this form was destroyed and rebuilt and reopened in 1931. So the negative from which this photograph was printed must have been made in or after 1931. Now, everything else we've been talking about is around 1891 through to the early years of what we would call the Edwardian period. Maybe 20 years from 1891, something like that. Now here we are with a glass photograph which looks different from the others that can't have been made before 1931. So there's probably a 20-year gap during which Mizuno died. So he definitely didn't make this one personally. So the hypothesis now is that the glass one, but certainly this glass one, was probably made by members of his family. Remember that they were still using this process or something like it for making memorials for deceased people. So they had the technology or some closely related technology, and maybe they saw an opportunity to have another go at the business in which father or grandfather, whoever he was at the time, was successful, because he had been. He told obviously quite a lot of pictures. So this picture definitely comes from that period. The hypothesis then is that maybe all of these glass ones, which do look different, don't have any labels, maybe all of these glass ones come from this period between 1931 and probably the Second World War, something like that. Now, some of the negatives are the same old negatives which had been used back in the day 20, 30, 40 years ago, but presumably if they had been kept would still be fine. So a lot of the material that's being printed is still the old stuff. This one is in the style of the old stuff, but it is not the old stuff. The other thing to say, I think at this point, is that these are not orotones, and this is another thing that museum professionals have got themselves in a muddle about. The best known gold print process on glass is a largely American product called orotone or Kurtone or several other names, and it refers to a particular style of presenting a transparency on glass in black and white transparency on glass made bromide or any other black and white negative positive process, backed with gold, let's call it paint, a gold suspension in some sort of medium. So there's a gold leaf or gold powder in resin backing on the image, and this is an example of an orotone. This one is standing up over there. And this produces a rich, warm, metallic background which shows through the transparent highlights. And to look at them just at the front, it would be very easy to confuse them with Type D, i.e. the Mizuno glass prints. The orotone is strongly associated with a photographer called Edward Sheriff Curtis, who was acclaimed for extensive and beautiful ethnographical studies of American Indians, as they were called then, Native North Americans, First Nation, what have you. although it is clear that actually Curtis wasn't the inventor of this process because it existed before he started to use it. And indeed it has continued to be used by a small number of American practitioners throughout the 20th century. If you look at the back of one of these things, it's a bit of a giveaway. That's the back of a Mizuno Type D. That's the back of an orotone. A Mizuno Type D is a gold print on a black lacquer ground, so the image is in gold and the backing is lacquer, black lacquer. An orotone, the image is in something black, usually silver, and it's painted with a backing of gold. So it's the inverse. It's the complete opposite, although to look at it from the front it looks very similar. However, as I say, if you look at the back, it's a giveaway, and if you look at the edges, if the edges happen to be exposed, if you look at the edges, you can see black edges on a Mizuno print and gold edges or gold borders on an orotone. So I think it's reasonable to assume that the orotone process was well known and it was contemporary with Mizuno himself and his early work. It was well established by the time that his family, presumably, were working on glass some decades later, but there is no necessary connection between the two, bearing in mind that the construction of the layers is completely different. And you can confirm this not only by looking at the backs and the borders, but if there's a little piece of damage, you can peep through the layers with a microscope and look at the damage, and you can see that the layers in the case of the Mizuno print are indeed the layers that you would expect from his patent and from the description of the process. He was you find the same negative used for wooden prints and for glass prints. I know this one is a bit damaged, but actually this is the same negative. This one on wood. There's the head of the deer. It's the same deer. Everything's in the same place. There it is on glass. There it is on wood again as an album cover, which I don't have this one. I saw this one in an auction, but I didn't buy it. So you've got the same negative being used in both processes, which is why we always thought originally that there was a close connection between them. Now I know, and I've already said, that he was using negatives by other people as well as negatives of his own. So the fact that the same negative has been used in more than one process is not a cast iron proof that the process was run by the same person. Similarly, there's a Type A version, that is to say, on wood. There is a Type B version, the same scene. Again, it's the same negative. Actually, Fuji in the water are better reproduced on the glass print than they are on the wooden one. You can just about see Fuji there. You can see it a lot better there. And there's another Type D, again, better still. Camibashi Bridge. Now this one, you can do all sorts of things with it. This one is pre-1891. And why is it pre-1891? Because in 1891 the electricity came in. We know when the electricity came in, and there's no electricity pole here, and there's an electricity pole there. So these are two different negatives, obviously of the same bridge, And we know we know that they're also before 1902 because the bridge was washed away in a flood in 1902. So actually, some of these things, just from the image, you can date them with considerable accuracy and confidence. There we are. There's another glass one, and this one's got a typical frame. I left the frame in this time. The frames on the Type D, the glass ones, are typically much simpler, slimmer. Again, it tends to speak of a different time period, doesn't it? What about in museums? Museums don't have many examples at all of any of this sort of thing. That is an album cover in the British Museum, quite badly damaged. You can see it sort of delaminated here, and that's some of the emulsion kind of splitting away from the wood, because it's on wood. It's had some restoration. It's not a scene I otherwise know, but it is a fairly obviously Japanese scene. We've made inquiries to museums all over the UK and drawn a blank. There's nothing in the National Media Museum, nothing in the Royal Photograph Collection, there's nothing in the Scottish National Photography Collection or the V&A. The British Museum album we've just seen here. The British Library has a cover with one on, just one. As there was organised export from Yokohama to the US, you might expect to find more examples there, and indeed in private hands you do. Most of the ones that you see popping up on eBay are in America. Not all of them, but the majority. We have located only one Mizuno in any US institution. That's in the San Diego Historical Society, where there's a photograph of General Mendel Churchill, who died in 1902. Doesn't mean that Mendel Churchill went to Japan, because he could have sent his picture over and had it done. There's a database at George Eastman House which records museum holdings in the USA, and including, of course, George Eastman House itself, and that contains no entries for Mizuno at all. So there aren't any acknowledged Mitsunos in the USA in museums. Of course, there are in private hands, quite a lot of them. In Japan, the story is a bit different. They were made for export, then they were exported. So the great majority of them are not in Japan, but of course there's a considerable amount of interest in Japan in their history, and of course including their photographic history. And there's a huge difference now between the prices of Mizuno prints held by Japanese dealers and those that you might find in this country, like 100 times higher or something like that. I mean, it's quite bizarre, unsustainable really. Though they would probably have particularly good quality ones there that they would be pushing at very high prices. There is the odd example. The Japan Camera Museum has got one example. Waseda University, which is fairly near to Shizuoka, did an exhibition of them and borrowed prints from various places to do so about 20 years ago. The Tokyo Metropolitan Museum of Photography has got a small collection of materials. We saw a sample earlier on of the transfer paper that they've got in their collection. So, and they've got a landscape panel with a picture of Fuji, a portrait and a small tray. So they have a few things. This is the British Library's album that I mentioned. That's a very, very well known, frequently reproduced photograph by Tamamura It occurs often in people's albums as an album in print. We've seen it in other Mizuno prints in both silver and in gold. In fact, this one's the gold version, and it's the British Library one. There's a silver version of it in the Royal Ontario Museum, which is, I mentioned Celio Barreto at the beginning. It's how he first got into this subject. He'd worked in Japan for some time, and when he came back to Canada, he was working in the Far Eastern archives of the museum, and he found the silver version of this that they have, and he thinks there are two other silver album covers in other Canadian museums. So there are a few around in museums, but not many. There's Mendel Churchill. He's the one who's in San Diego. I mentioned him before. We talked to Mrs. Izakura in Tokyo in the museum about why there are so few of these in museum collections, and she thought there were several reasons. The subjects were mostly sightseeing and tourism landscapes, which weren't terribly interesting to curators. Photographs in Japan in general have not until recently been recognised as having any sort of inherent artistic value. If there are portraits, they're not of famous people, so museums aren't very interested in portraits of ordinary folk. And there's a technical issue too, that the gradation of one of these prints is on the whole not as good as the gradation of the same negative printed conventionally on paper by any of the normal paper processes. So they tend to the soot and whitewash and to losing either highlight detail or shadow detail, and so photographically they are not as good as paper prints can be. This one it appears to be a fairly standard type A print. It's got the usual structure. It's got a decorative border on the front for a change instead of a frame. This one is in a museum in Zurich, so there's at least one in Europe. The caption describes the process completely wrongly. Says it's a collar type on a gold panel. Well, why anybody would even think that, I don't know. They read something in a book and copied it out, is the answer. This one is a portrait of Wilhelmina, Queen of the Netherlands, in 1896, and it's in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. So there's another one in Europe. Condition. Most of the prints we see now are in less than perfect condition. Despite being constructed from materials which chemically ought to last for ages and ages. Lacquer work, golden lacquer work, has survived hundreds of years when made by hand. So the materials are stable enough, although actually lacquer is not that stable to UV light, and so if you hang them up in the sunshine for some time, the surface will lose its shine. It will become dull as the UV light causes the lacquer itself to deteriorate. This is just an illustration of the sort of thing you can find. That's a water droplet. I expect the operator breathed or something during production. This is a magnification 100 times. So that is a little water droplet that settled and prevented the gold from sticking to the sticky surface, and so you get a little gap. So gold lacquer prints are typically in some sort of damaged condition, sometimes quite bad, This one is coming apart completely. This one's not one of mine. Lacquer on wood in this case. The main causes of defects are separation of the lacquer from the underlying wood, so the lacquer layer is splitting off the wood, and that happens from time to time. You do see that, and it sort of bubbles up, and if it bubbles up badly, it can crack and even come off. And also abrasion. If you think your picture is a bit dirty and you get out a cloth and start rubbing it to smarten it up, the only effect is to rub the picture away completely. One of those images of the deer at Nara that we saw earlier had obviously been over enthusiastically cleaned by somebody who wasn't looking what he or she was doing. But this sort of look of general decay is not completely unknown, and if you rub it, the typical effect is to rub off gold, and then the underlying lacquer will show through. So reduction in gold and its replacement by black is a typical result. And there's another one. It's a sort of normal genre scene. Some girls, one of them with a parasol, seems to have got measles. Basically, somehow, the structure is failing. The lacquer on glass ones, the story is a bit different. They're protected from abrasion, so this is a magnification under carefully tweaked lighting, so that you can see what delamination does. What tends to happen is that the lacquer layer starts to delaminate, spring away from the surface of the glass. Now this is the rear surface of the glass, so this is presumably expansion and contraction or humidity changes, whatever, causing gradually the lacquer to work its way off the glass surface. And in bad cases it might fall off altogether in parts, and I have seen that. But from a distance and sort of more superficially, you can, if you look at the glass ones, on the whole they look better because they don't have the abrasion and bits of rubbed off picture that the wood ones tend to have. How rare are they? How much are they worth? Better address this question amongst collectors. He was in business for a long time, and he produced a lot of pictures. I don't think anybody has got the slightest idea what a lot is, but he was doing this for at least 20 years, and that's never mind the glass ones, just the wooden ones. They are sufficiently out of the ordinary for them not to just get casually trashed. They are obviously gold, so anyway people aren't, if they've got one, they're going to be reluctant to throw it away. So you can assume safely that he made a lot of them originally, and I don't know what I mean by a lot, but let's say thousands anyway. But a good proportion of those might still be with us. So, where are they? Well, the answer is, I think they're all over the place. I come across them in antique shops. I come across them regularly on eBay. I come across them at car boot sales. I found one on a friend's bedroom wall. They are kind of unnoticed. Yeah. We won't go into that if you don't mind. Celia was there. Whoa. Enough. So in the West, what might you expect to pay? Well, I've paid on average £40 for a picture, 50 maybe, something that order of magnitude. In Japan, a nice one in a nice frame, £1,000. it's a completely different world. The ones in the West tend not to be particularly in good condition, so they may not be particularly attractive to a top dealer in Japan. So these are not truly comparable figures, because the propensity to being damaged is enough to is enough to sort of shade down the value considerably, I think. A quick survey of the image dealers at Photographica 2007. This was just before we finished off the article. Showed that a few of them had seen the odd example. The majority had never seen one or heard of one. One collector that I know had at that point been collecting for 20 years and had not yet got 20 examples. I've been collecting for 20 years and have about 30, so same order of magnitude. If you decide to roll up your sleeves and collect these things, you might hope to get one a year, something like that, if you keep your eyes open and point out to your friends how keen you are. I think I've reached the end now. You'll be pleased to know. There's the original article in PW122. There's Celio's article in PW157, both of which are available on the club website. So you can read even more detail than I have given you today. But what you have heard today is the latest news. Thank you very much.
Thank you.